This time we're going to look at what some have called the most versatile aircraft that the U.S. Navy had during the Cold War. Hi, Misha here. In this video, because you've read the title, you know, is on the Lockheed S-3 Viking. And I have two Hobbymaster 1/72 scale die-cast models. On the left, I have the S-3A. This was the original anti-submarine warfare ASW version, used back in the 70s and 80s. And on the spinny thing, I have the updated S-3B, which was more of a multi-role aircraft. They really did perform quite a few duties back in the 90s and early 2000s. This aircraft is now out of service, but it was only it was retired from frontline service about a decade ago, but the last examples weren't taken out of Navy service till about 4 years ago. So it had a respectably long career. And it all began back in the 1960s. The U.S. Navy needed a new anti-submarine aircraft that could both detect and destroy, or at least pin down, subs. And this is because while the U.S. Navy, of course, had the most impressive carriers of the day, the Russian Navy had a large and quite sophisticated submersible fleet. And they had been using the Grumman S-2 tracker, but it was an old piston engine, and it just didn't have modern computer systems, avionics, and the ability. So what the Navy needed was something that could detect subs, carry torpedoes, depth charges, also that could integrate new computerized systems, data collection, kind of serve as the eyes of the fleet beyond visual range, beyond the horizon. It needed to have good loiter time, good endurance, good range. But it was not to ever be a fighter or anything like that, not at all. In 1968, it came down to two companies, Lockheed and a consortium of Convair and Grumman. Both were teams kind of that the Navy asked to develop the new aircraft. And since Lockheed, while it had a good bit of military experience, had mostly designed Air Force aircraft, they asked LTV, formerly Vought, who had a lot of carrier aircraft experience, especially most recently with the A7 and F8. Been doing too many gun videos lately. But to help, and Vought, LTV, Wing Timco Vought, would design the folding wing system, the super duper reinforced landing gear, the folding tail, and even the nacelles that would go for the two engines. And the engines that Lockheed selected were turbofan for that needed range. They also were very fuel efficient for endurance, but not especially fast. But that's okay. In August of 1969, the Lockheed design, then designated S-3A, was selected, and 8 prototypes or pre-production models were ordered, and they would get to work. The first prototype was ready at the end of 1971, and it took to the skies in January of 1972, and after a bit of refinement, it would first go into service in 1974. The first squadron was declared operational in February of 1974. That was land-based out of California, but it wouldn't be long before the new S-3A Viking, as it was known, would have its first cruise. That would be in 1975 on board the carrier USS John F. Kennedy. And from that point, they would continue to be used in both the Pacific and Atlantic. And basically, they were all made in one big production run between 1974 and 1978. And all were initially made as S-3As. And sources say they were between, some say 186, some say 187, some say 188. I say make up your damn mind. Either way, you get the idea. A little under 200 were made in one big run, and then that was it. The U.S. Navy was the only customer. So what did they come up with here? It's a pretty cool aircraft. The lines are very conventional. It is only about 53 feet long, but it has quite a big wingspan of nearly 69 feet, again for its intended role, to hover over the ocean and make long, lazy patrol sleeps. Those turbofan engines didn't suck the gas, but they also didn't put pedal to the metal. They couldn't even get up to 500 miles per hour. The max speed was about 490, 495, but they preferred to cruise at a leisurely 400 miles per hour. So we're talking World War II fighter speeds. But these could hang in the air a very long time. 2 engines, they were reliable. And it could easily, and it was designed from the beginning to operate from a carrier. Where it shined was in its payload and computer systems. This was one of the first to have all of its sensors and avionics routed through one central generalized computer system. Now, it had a crew of 4. You had a pilot and co-pilot in the front seats, and then you had a TACO and a CENSO, a tactical and a sensor operator in the back. And what's neat, the TACO and CENSO and co-pilot had multi-function displays, and so they could all 3 share data, look at the same data, work on the same data, that way they could really coordinate, leaving the pilot to do his job. So work share was very good. They had very good sensor equipment on. They had, of course, magnetic anomaly detection, MAD systems for subs. They also had electronic warfare for defense. They could carry up to 90 rounds of chaff or flares for defense. That's really about all they had for defense. But then again, these were always escorted by fighters. So it definitely had nothing to really go against the air. No cannon or anything, no air-to-air missiles. But what it did have was nearly a 5,000-pound payload of air to surface or air to subsurface. It could carry a very wide range of weapons, anything from just traditional iron bombs to guided missiles, depth charges, cluster bombs, torpedoes. Later in its life, it would get laser-guided bombs, like the Maverick. You could also mount fuel tanks under the wings. It essentially has only 2 wing point hardpoints, or underwing hardpoints, but they can have quite a large capacity, each one, as you can see by the stores under either of these. And it also had 4 additional hardpoints and an internal bay for smaller type munitions. It could even carry travel pods for putting cargo in those places. It was just a very well thought out system. It even had a well thought out ejection seat arrangement where if the pilot or co-pilot ejected, all 4 would go out. But if one of the 2 rear guys ejected, they would be the only ones. Just a safety measure. Had a max altitude of a bit over 40,000 feet. So not high or low. Had a very good radar. Initially used inertial navigation systems. These pods on the wings you see were actually to detect electronic emissions. And so while this was primarily an anti-submarine and submarine, defense protection aircraft, it was used for other types of intelligence gathering and surveillance, especially as its life would draw on. So not really a lot to say about it in the 70s. By the late 70s, squadrons had been re-equipped. In 1984, the improved S-3B prototype flew, and then in 1987 it was decided to upgrade the majority of the S-3As in the fleet to the new S-3B standard. This gave it a new radar. It also gave it a buddy fueling system which allowed this to refuel other aircraft. Interestingly, the old A4 could do the same thing. Its weapons systems were expanded. It could even use more weapons. And generally, its computers and avionics and all that good stuff were expanded as well. So they were just starting to redo these. The first squadron equipped with the S-3B appeared in July of 1988. And so these were just coming online for the 1991 Gulf War, which is when the Viking really saw its first true offensive combat. And that war was used again to protect the fleet, to screen the fleet. Also, it was used, its new refueling capability was used, especially as planes were coming into land. If they were really running on fumes, they could link up with one of these and tip off so they had time to get it on board safely. And these were used a few times to hit high-value Iraqi targets during that war. They were also deployed in support of UN actions in the 1990s in the former Yugoslavia. They were again called upon in 2001 when the U.S. went to Afghanistan. And probably the highlight of the S-3B's career came in March of 2003. when one of these was sent to destroy part of the Iraqi Naval High Command structure, a high-value target, using a laser-guided Maverick cruise missile, and did so successfully and in a very timely and effective manner. This is the first time a Viking used a laser-guided munitions in anger. It really would be one of the last, frankly, but it did show its use. It also showed that it had successfully been transferred from being an anti-submarine warfare, because, obviously, between 1989 and 1991, the Warsaw Pact fell apart, and thus the threat of Russian submarines was greatly diminished. So the S-3Bs would often have their anti-submarine warfare equipment, like the magnetic anomaly systems removed, thus freeing up spaces for other things or just taking weight out. When that happened, the Senso in the back was pulled out, so the crew was often downsized from 4 to 3 in the 1990s. And these were reconfigured to be more of an anti-surface vessel, or intelligence gathering reconnaissance. Again, kind of an over-the-horizon aircraft for the Navy. Also, they began to be used more and more as a tanker. And when that happened, the taco in the back would go away, meaning in some instances the crew was down to just a pilot and co-pilot. But again, if it's a flying tanker, then, that's what you need. So really, by 1997, all of the anti-submarine Vikings were gone, and instead we have the new surface, or as they were called, sea control Vikings in use. They would also do a few other versions. For example, the S-3A, they would make 16 of these, beginning in 1991, fielding them first in 1993 as electronic intelligence gathering aircraft. They would also convert 6 of these to S-3As as kind of an interesting cargo utility aircraft that could either carry about 4,500 pounds of cargo or 6 passengers. So they basically extended the cockpit back a bit. But they only did 6 of those. And both of those, the ES-3 and the US-3, were out of service by the turn of the millennium thanks to budget cuts. Again, remember, this is pre-War on Terror. So in the late 90s, the military was having to justify every dime. And a dinosaur of the Cold War, to kind of quote Judi Dench, was something that could easily be cut from the budget in some instances, especially specialized versions. But the 3Bs would continue on. Many of these would be fitted with lantern pods during the continuing War on Terror, 2004-2005, used to support operations throughout Iraq and Afghanistan to gather intelligence and support friendly aircraft. And then the final S-3Bs finished their last cruise at the end of 2008, and they were retired from frontline service in January of 2009. But the Navy would still keep some around for secondary roles until the end of 2015, and then in January of 2016, the final 3 that were at that time still in Navy service would be sent away. 2 would be outright scrapped, and 1 would be given to NASA, who had been flying the Viking in small numbers for a few years at that point. So the only 2 operators, primarily of course, would just be the U.S. Navy, but a small secondary use would be the U.S. institution of NASA. They use these for various testing. Interestingly, there have been talks over the years about bringing the Viking back because it's said that no one plane could do all this one could, and if you look at who replaced it, you have things like the P-3 Orion, you have the SH-60 Seahawk, you have the FA-18 Hornet and FA-18 Super Hornet. It did take multiple aircraft to replace it. So there have been talks, but as of 2020, hasn't really come to anything. Some of these are in mothballs, so they were stored in a way that they could be reactivated if they were ever needed. It's also worth mentioning, on a political front, it was one of these that George W. Bush took a ride in as its co-pilot on May 1st of 2003 when he had his famous or infamous mission accomplished speech off the coast of California. In fact, Hobbymaster does an exact model of that aircraft, which was retired after Bush used it in his political thing. Just a little fun footnote. Keep in mind that George W. Bush was in the Air Guard, so he had some experience with aircraft in his younger days. So it got a little press time when people saw that. But yeah, I like these support type craft, and it definitely is, has offensive things, and we've got each of these comes with a few different ordnance setups. By the way, they'll have it here is considered correct, kind of asymmetrical. It also came with a couple of Maverick missiles and a few other things. This one over here, we've got the, I'm not sure, are those cluster bombs or depth charges torpedoes? You guys tell me. That's one thing I have a hard time is telling ordnance variations apart, because you can't really read on Wiki. They show pictures, those don't help me much, and Hobbymaster doesn't really tell you either, so I'm a little bit at a loss. As far as the models themselves, I think by now you kind of know the Hobbymaster deal. Gear up or down, obviously ordnance you can select. They give you a few different sets with each of these, which is neat. You can only put, of course, 2 at a time on. The internal bays don't open. The canopy opens, although in reality, to get in the aircraft they use to hatch. But you can open the canopy if you want to put the pilots in or not. Interestingly, it only has the pilot and co-pilot in both of these. The back 2 seats are kind of recessed there where you can't even see them. So they just included the 2 front crew. But that's alright. Of course, there are a few differences in the paint. The antenna, the sensors are a little different from the A and the B. One thing I've noticed because of the weight distribution, the stand where it joins the top and the bottom up here likes to kind of tilt. So I put a little dotted glue in there, and that fixes it. I don't glue the plane to the stand, obviously. I glue the stand to itself at the top. Some of the Hobbymasters do that. But that's kind of my only real complaint about Hobbymasters, a general thing. I wish they did a little better stands. Corgi and Air Force One both do better stands. But considering everything else, they're durable, well detailed, and usually have a high metal content. And they usually come with more than one set of ordnance, which is always appreciated, so, take what you can get. But yeah, just thought I'd share this with you folks. If you have any questions or just want to share your appreciation for the Viking, love to talk below. I just think it has that Cold War cool factor. I mean, you don't see many modern jet edge planes that look like this and that were so capable. I mean, kind of externally it looks a little retro even for then, but the computer systems and the integration were state of the art. And thanks to continual upgrades over the years, they remain state of the art. Alrighty guys, I think I'm going to hit the hay for the night. Appreciate you tuning in. And I'll be back next time with something. I'll catch you then.